everybody, it's Susan. Welcome to my channel, Susan Diamond Paint. February 3rd devotional, Ephesians 4:32. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as Christ God forgave you. This day in history, February 3rd, a list of historical events. 1690, the first paper money in America was issued today in the colony of Massachusetts. 1783, during the American Revolutionary War, Spain recognized the United States independence. 1809, the 10th United States Congress created the territory of Illinois. 1834, Wake Forest University was established in North Carolina. 1870, the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution is ratified, guaranteeing voting rights to male citizens regardless of race. 1913, the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution is ratified, authorizing the federal government to impose and collect an income tax. 1931, the Hawke's Bay earthquake, New Zealand's worst natural disaster, killed 258 people. 1891, the official electrical lighting of London streets commenced. 1889, outlaw Bill Starr was murdered in Oklahoma and shot twice in the back. 1923, volcano eruption, Kamchatka. 1943, a German U-boat sank the SS Dorchester. Only 230 of the 902 men aboard survived. The event is described in a Ford Chaplin story. 1947, the coldest weather ever recorded in North America was Snag, Yukon, which was minus 63 degrees Celsius or minus 81 degrees Fahrenheit. 1953, Jacques Cousteau's book The Silent World was published. 1959, rock and roll musicians Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and J.P. the Big Bopper Richardson are killed in a plane crash near Clear Lake, Iowa. 1968, the number one hit for February 3rd, 1968 to February 9th, 1968 was the Lemon Pipers' Green Tambourine. 1971, New York police officer Frank Shapiro was shot during a drug bust in Brooklyn and survived to testify against police corruption. 1973, the number one hit February 3rd of 1973 to February 23rd of 1973, Elton John's Crocodile Rock. 1984, the Challenger launch from the Kennedy Space Center. 2001, number one hit February 3rd, 2001 to February 16th, 2001, Shaggy, featuring Rick Rock Dusant, It Wasn't Me. 2008, the Naked Brothers Band premiered on Nickelodeon. 2009, Harry Potter author J.K. Rowling was made Knight of the Légion d'Honneur, which is France's highest civilian award. February 1st, number one hit, February 3rd, 2018 to April 20th, 2018, Drake, God's Plan. And then I'm going to give you a little bit of trivia. So the U.S. President, number 7, Andrew Jackson, from 1829 to 1837, he was also the first president to ride a train. A quote, is a damn poor mind indeed which can't think of at least 2 ways to spell any word. Jackson threw a large party when he was inaugurated, and his friends trashed the White House. An assassination attempt was made on him in 1835 by the deranged Richard Lawrence on the steps of the Capitol building. His pistols did not fire, and Jackson beat the disarmed attacker with his cane. Biggest film of 1994, The Lion King, earned $423 million. A group of kangaroos is also called a troop, a mob, or a herd. So instead of the mob taking you out, it may not be people, it might be kangaroos. Love Story by Irving Cox. The duty bell rang, and obediently George clattered down the steps from his confinement cubicle over the garage. His mama's chartreuse-colored Cadillac convertible purred to a stop in the drive. It's so sweet of you to come, Georgie, his mama said when George opened the door for her. Whenever you need me, Mummy. It was no trouble to keep the snicker out of his voice. Deception had become a part of his character. His mama squeezed his arm. I can always count on my little boy to do the right thing. Yes, Mummy. They were mouthing a formula of words. They were both veritably important, apprehensive that if George had not snapped to attention as soon as the duty bell chimed, he risked being doomed, at least temporarily, to the public idol's fraternity. Still, in the customary fatalities tale, George's mama said, "This has been such a tiring day. A man can no way understand what a woman has to endure, Georgie.
My life is such a fire." Her tone turned a formerly coldly practical. "I have 2 packages in the box. Carry them to the house for me." George picked up the cardboard boxes and followed her along the slip-up walk in the direction of the white social manse where his mamma and her 2 daughters and her current hubby lived. George, being a boy, was allowed in the house only when his mamma invited him in or when he was being shown off to a prospective bridegroom. George was 19, the most respectable marriage age. Because he had a magnificent figure and a character for being a good boy, his mamma was rooted to being asking 20,000 shares for him. As they passed the rose dome, his mamma dropped on the rustic seat and drew George down beside her. "I have a surprise for you, George, a new endeavor. Mrs. Harper is allowing about you for her son." "Jenny Harper?" Suddenly his throat was dust dry with excitement. "You'd like that, wouldn't you, Georgie?" "Whatever arrangement you make, Mummy." Jenny Harper was one of the many outlanders George had sometimes seen as he grew up. She was roughly his age, a stunning dark-eyed brunette. "Jenny and her mamma are coming to the Regalia to talk over a marriage agreement." Speculatively she ran her hand over the scrounged muscle hard whipped of his upper arm. "You are anxious to have your own woman, are you not, George?" So I can begin to work for her, Mummy." That, at least, was the correct answer, if not an honest bone. "And begin taking the emulsion every day." His mamma smiled. "Oh, I know you wicked boys. Put on your dress caddies tonight. We want Jenny to see you at your stylish." She got up and paraded toward the house again. George followed her hypercritically 2 paces behind her. As they passed beyond the theater barricade, she saw the old business coupe situated in the delivery court. Her body strengthened in a wrathfulness. "Why is your father home so beforehand, may I ask?" It was a blameworthiness rather than a question. "I do not know, Mother. I heard my sisters talking in the yard. I suppose he was taken sick at work." "Sick! Some men never stop pampering themselves. They said it was a heart attack or—" "Ridiculous! He isn't dead, is he? Georgie, this is the last straw. I intend to trade your father in today on a younger man." She snatched the 2 packages from him and stormed into the house. Since his mamma had not asked him in, George returned to his confinement chamber in the garage. He felt sorry, an impersonal way, for the hubby his mamma was about to dispose of, but else the fate of the old man was relatively normal. He'd outlasted his profitable utility. George had seen it be ahead. His real father had failed a natural death from strain and overwork when George was 4. His mamma had since also bought 4 other misters, but because boys were brought up in a rigid insulation, George had known none of them well. For the same reason he knew particular musketeers. He climbed the narrow stairway to his chamber. It was formerly late autumn, nearly time for the regalia. He poured and waxed his body precisely before he put his dress caddies, missions made of black silk speckled with seed plums and small diamonds. He was permitted to wear the jewels because his mamma's stock holdings were large enough to make her an associate director. His family status gave George a high marriage value, and his Adonis constitution demurred the asking price still advanced. At 19 he stood further than 6 bases altitudes, indeed without his formal high-heeled thrills. He counted 185, not an ounce of it redundant fat. His skin was deeply bronzed by the sunlights in the spa. His eyes were sapphire blue. His crew cut was a platinum blonde, thanks to the peroxide wash his mamma made him use. Observing himself critically in the full-length glass, George knew his mamma was justified in asking 20,000 shares for him. Marriage was an essential part of his own plans. Without it, vengeance was out of his reach. He desperately hoped the deal would be made with Jenny Harper. A youthful woman would be far less delicate for him to handle. When the canvas on his skin was dry, he lay down on his bunk to catch up on his needed viewing until the duty bell called him to the house. The automatic circuit snapped on the TV screen above his bunk. Wearily, George fixed his eyes on the unreeling love story. For as long as he could remember, TV had been an obsidian part of his education. A civil law needed every joker to watch the television love 3 hours a day. failure to do so, and that was determined by yearly form tests posted out by the Doctorate, meant a 3-month judgment to the public idol's corpse. However, George was a fairly rare case, having survived nonage without serving a single stint of duty as a public idol, if the statistics periodically published by the Doctorate were true, for that he latterly thanked his impunity to the emulsion. Fear and guilt kept him on his toes. He grew up an astonishingly well-chastened child. George was apprehensive that the TV loves were designed to shape his stations and his emotional responses. The stories endlessly repeated his mama's gospel. All men were pictured as beasts, crudely dominated by lust. Women, on the other hand, were always sensitive, delicate, modest, and intelligent. Their martyrdom to the men in their lives was called love. To pay for their beast lust, men were anticipated to slave down their lives, earning effects, kitchen widgets, menage appliances, fancy buses, luxuries, and stock holdings for their long-suffering women. And it's all a fake, George thought. He had seen his mother drive 2 men to their graves and trade off 2 others because they hadn't produced luxuries as fast as she demanded. His mother and his pinched-faced sisters were pampered, selfish, rock-hard Amazons. By no conceivable twist of imagination could they all be called martyrs to anything. That sounded apparent, but George had no way of knowing if any other man had ever reasoned out the same conclusion. Perhaps he was unique because of his impunity to the emulsion. He was sure that veritably many men, conceivably none, had reached marriage age with their impunity still undiscovered. George was lucky, in a way. He knew the truth about himself when he was 7, and he had time to adjust to it, to plan the role he had been acting for the past 12 years. His early childhood had been a livid nightmare, primarily because of the precocious cruelty of his 2 sisters. Shortly before his 7th birthday, they forced him to take part in a game they called the cocktail party. The game involved only one activity. The 2 little girls filled a glass with an unidentified liquid and ordered George to drink. Afterward, dancing up and down in girlish glee, they said they had given him the compound. George had seen the love stories on TV. He knew how he was anticipated to act. He gave a good performance, better than his sisters realized, for inside his mind, George was in the fermentation. They had given him the emulsion. True, times before he should have taken it, and nothing had happened. He felt absolutely nothing. He was vulnerable. If anyone ever planned out, George would have been given a life judgment to the public idols fraternity, or more presumably the moral squad would have disposed of him altogether. From that day on, George lived with guilt and fear. As times passed, he several times stole capsules of the emulsion from his mama's love press and gulped them down. Occasionally he felt a little giddy, and formally he was sick, but he endured no response which conceivably be defined as love. Not that he had any idea what that response should have been, but he knew he was supposed to feel veritably wicked, and he no way did. Each failure increased the agony of guilt. George drove himself to be far more conducted than he was needed to be. He dreaded making one mistake. However, they might find out his real secret if his mama or a director examined it too nearly. George's introductory education began when he was assigned to his confinement room above the garage after his 10th birthday. Later, his time was completely regulated by law. 3 hours a day he watched TV. 3 hours he spent in his spa, erecting a magnificent and soluble body. For 4 hours he heeded to the educational videotapes, computation, economics, salesmanship, business ways, account, mechanics, practical wisdom, the effects he took know in order to earn a satisfactory living for the woman who bought him for marriage. He learned nothing additional, and he grew aged. He became veritably conscious of the gaps in his education. For case, what of the history? Had the world always been the sham he lived in? That question he'd the good sense not to ask. But George had learned enough from his assignments and practical wisdom to guess what the emotion really was. What it had to be a mixture of an aphrodisiac and a habit-forming medicine. The emotion was calculated to stir up a man's desire to the point where he'd give up anything in order to satisfy it. Boys were given increased bonuses during their manage, but by the time they were married, they were addicts, unfit to leave the emotion alone. George couldn't prove his conclusion. He had no idea how many other men had followed the same line of reasoning and come up with the same answer. But why was George immune? There was only one way he could figure it. It must have happened because his sisters gave him the first draft when he was 7, but logically that didn't make much sense. Maids were another kind of adversary men who shirked their duty and deserted their women. It sounded unreasonable to believe a man could desert his woman when he to break himself a dependence of the emotion. George had always supposed that a bachelorette was a boogie word simulated to scarify growing children. As a consequence, he was veritably surprised when the house-coming door was raided. Through the window of his confinement chamber, he actually saw the 5 Argentine-haired men who were rounded up by the moral squad. The squad, heavily fortified 6-bottom Amazons, tried to question their internees. They used injections of the Verity serum. 2 of the old men failed at it formerly. The others went berserk, salivating at the mouth and screaming beast obscenity until the squad captain ordered them shot. George eavesdropped one of the women say, "It's always like this. They take commodities so our serum cannot be effective." Latterly that autumn, George planted a scrap of paper in his mama's theater. It had blown out of the campfire where the moral squad made of papers they took out of the house-coming door. The burned runner had supposedly been part of an instructional bulletin collected by the maids for the distribution among themselves. Data collected from old publications, the scrap began, and interpreted by most dependable authorities. At that point, a part of the runner was burned down, and maybe lower than 90 times ago men and women lived in equalness. The substantiation on that point is entirely conclusive. The present matriarchy evolved by accident, not design. 90 times ago, entertainment and advertising were simply directed at satisfying a woman's vagrancy. No product was vended without some kind of tie heft with women. Fabrication, drama, TV, stir film lamp, all glorified a romantic thing called love. In that same period, business was in the process of taking over government from statesmen and politicians. Women, of course, were the stockholders who possessed big business, although directors and the directors at the time were still men, operating under the vision that they were the directors who represented power. In effect, still, women possessed the country and the women governed it. Suddenly, the matriarchy was. There's no substantiation that it was assessed. There's no suggestion of civil strife or, further words, burned down. Still, the women weren't unintentional to consolidate their earnings. Accordingly, the popular superlatives, the suitable loves, and the cliches of advertising came a cover for reality. And as for the emulsion, there the scrap ended. Important of it George didn't understand, but it gave him a great deal of courage simply to know the maze actually was. He began to plan his own escape to a bachelorette den. He'd have no occasion, no freedom of any kind, until he married. Every boy was strictly insulated in his confinement chamber under the vigilant eye of his mama's asset cameras until he was bought in his first marriage. Also, as he allowed further about it, George realized there was a better way for him to use his impunity. He could not be sure of chancing a bachelorette den before the moral squads tracked him down, but George could force his bridegroom to tell him where the emulsion was made, since he wasn't an addict and she couldn't use the emulsion to enslave him. Once he knew the position of the plant, he'd destroy it. How, he wasn't sure. He didn't plan that far ahead. If the supply of the drug could be interrupted, many hundreds of men might be goaded into making a break for the hills. The duty bell rang. George snapped to attention on the edge of his bunk. He saw his mother waving from the back door of her house. "I'll be right away, Mummy." His mother was waiting for him in the pantry. Under the glaring overhead light, he stopped for her last minute inspection. She used a pocket stick to touch up a spot on his chest where the oil gleam had faded a little, and she gave him a glass of the compound to drink. "Jenny really wants to marry you, George," she commended. "I know the symptoms. Half of our battle is won for us, and my former hubby will not be around to worry us with his pangs and pains. I made the trade this autumn." He followed her into the dining room where the allegations were being served. Away from the Harpers, George's mamma had rented two handsome muscular escorts for his sisters. In the confusion, George saw Jenny Harper's mamma steadily lace his water glass with the cure of the emulsion. He suppressed a grin. Supposedly she was anxious to complete the deal too. George planned it nearly insolvable to hold back ridiculous horse laughs when Jenny herself shyly pressed the capsule of the emulsion into his hand and asked him to use it. 3 full-sized slugs of the medicine. George wondered what would have happened if he had not been vulnerable. Fortunately, he knew how to act the lusty, eager, drooling joker which each of the women anticipated. The accommodations moved on without a hitch. George's mamma held out for 28,000 shares and got it. The only problem left was the date for the marriage, and Jenny settled that veritably snappily. "I want my man, Mama," she said, "and I want him now." Jenny always got what she wanted. When she and her mamma left that evening, she held George's hand in hers and murmured earnestly, "So they were wedded and lived happily ever after. And that is the way this is going to be with us, is it not, George? It's over to you, Jenny, for as long as you want me." That was the conventional answer which he was anticipated to make, but he saw unmasked disappointment in her face. She wanted a commodity further genuine, with further of himself in it. He felt suddenly sorry for her, for the way he was going to use her. She was a suitable girl, indeed sweet and innocent, if those words still had any real meaning left after what his mamma's world had done to them. Under other circumstances, George would have looked forward with keen pleasure to marrying Jenny. As it was, Jenny Harper was at first a symbol of the fakery he intended to destroy, and after that a woman. 5 days later they were married. In spite of the short engagement, Mrs. Harper and George's mother managed to put on a splendid show in the church. George received a business sedan from his mother, the traditional gift given every bridegroom, and from Mrs. Harper he received a good job in the company where she was the majority stockholder. And so the customary pageantry and ceremony, George became Mr. Harper. "Think of it, Mr. Harper," Jenny sighed, clinging to his arm. "Now you're really mine, George." On the church steps the newlyweds posed for photos, George in the plain white caddies which represented a first marriage, Jenny in a glowing pall of fluff suggestively nearly transparent. Also Mrs. Harper drew Jenny away and rumored in her son's observance the traditional telling of the secret. Now Jenny knew where the emulsion was manufactured, and for George vengeance was within his grasp. George's mamma had arranged for their honeymoon at Memory Lodge, a resort not far from the Detroit capital in Hollywood. It was the public capital as well, though everyone rigorously maintained the pretense that Washington, with each manly Congress, still governed the country. George considered himself lucky that his mamma had chosen the Memory Lodge. He formerly planned to desert Jenny in the mountains. George knew how to drive. His mamma had wanted him to do a great deal of dragging for her, but he'd no way driven beyond the city, and he'd no way driven anywhere alone. His mamma gave him a chart on which his route to the lodge was indicated in bright red. In the foothills, George left a pronounced trace on a paved side road. He played that Jenny wouldn't incontinently realize what he'd done, and the adventure paid off. Still wearing her nearly transparent marriage gown, she pressed close to him and ran her hands constantly over his naked casket, completely satisfied with the man she had bought. In the church, George had been given a autonomous glass of the emulsion. He acted the part Jenny anticipated, but it was far less a part he played than George wanted to admit. His body sang with excitement. He planned it veritably delicate to hold the excitement in check. However, it would have been out of the question if he had been addicted to the emulsion. Further than ever before he sympathized with men who were enslaved by love. In the malignancy of his own impunity, he nearly yielded to the sensuous appeal of her pat, and he held the wheel so hard his knuckles went white. He gripped his teeth until his jaw pained. All autumn, George drove random mountain roads, moving deeper into the uninhabited defiles, precisely judging his distances with an eye on the chart. He saw to it that he remained fairly close to the mega-city After he forced Jenny to give him the information he wanted to be suitable to get out presto. By dusk the roads he drove were no longer paved. Routine sculpted deep by spring rain suggested long destitute. The persuading of the auto and the constant grinding of gears ultimately jolted Jenny out of her romantic dreams. She moved down from George and sat looking at the pines which met above the road. "We are lost, are we?" she asked. "What is that?" he cried, to be heard above the motor. "Lost!" For a moment or two longer he continued to drive until he saw an open space under the trees. He pulled the car into the clearing and snapped off the ignition. Then he looked Jenny full in the face and he answered her, "No, Jenny, we aren't lost. I know exactly what I'm doing." Oh, he was sure she had understood him, but she said, "We can spend the night here and find the lodge in the morning. It's a pity we didn't bring something to eat." She smiled ingenuously. "But I brought the compound and we have each other." They got out of the car. Jenny looked up at the sunset, dull red above the trees, and shivered. She asked George to build a fire. He tucked the ignition key into the band of his white trunks, and he began to gather dry boughs and pine needles from the floor of the forest. He found several large branches and carried them back to the clearing. There was enough wood to last until morning, whether he stayed that long or not. Jenny had lugged the seats and a blanket out of the car and improvised a lean-to close to the fire. He piled on two of the larger branches, and the bright gleam of honey lit their faces. She signaled to him and gave him the bottle of the emotion, watching bright eyes as he voided it. With her lips parted, she awaited. He did nothing. Sluggishly, the light failed in her eyes. Like a barbarian, she slung herself into his arms. He steeled himself to show absolutely no response, and eventually she drew down. Pulsing and with gashes in her eyes, she murmured, "The emotion doesn't." The look of pain in her eyes turned to terror. "You are vulnerable. Now you know." "But who told you?" She searched his face, shaking her head. "You do not know, do you? Not really?" "Know what?" Rather of replying, she asked, "You brought me then, designedly, didn't you? So we wouldn't be intruded. You see, Jenny, you are going to tell me where the emulsion's made. It wouldn't do you any good. Do you not see?" He closed his hands on her wrist and jerked her rudely to her bases. He saw her face go white, and no wonder that magnificent, determined, hardened body, which she had bought in good faith for her own pleasure, was suddenly out of her control. He beamed. He crushed her mouth against his and kissed her. Limp in his arms, she clung to him and said in a choked husky tale, "I love you, George." "And you will make any emulation for love," he replied, mocking the dialogue of the TV love stories. "Yes, anything. Also, tell me where the emulsion's manufactured." "Hold me near, George." "No way. Let me go." How numerous times had he heard that particular line. It repulsed him. Hearing it now from Jenny, he anticipated commodity better of her. He pushed her from him. By accident his fist dredged her face. She fell back, blood trickling from her mouth. In her eyes he saw shock and a vague sense of pain, but both were hoofed by adoration. She was like a whipped pup, ready to master his hand. "I will tell you, George," she murmured, "but do not leave me." She pulled herself to her bases and stood beside him, reaching for his hand. "We make it in Hollywood in the Dictorate building, the part that used to be the sound stage." "Thanks, Jenny." He picked up one of the auto seats and walked back to the hydrofoil. She stood motionlessly watching him. He fitted the seat in place and put the key in the cinch. The starter ground down, but the motor didn't turn over. He glanced back at Jenny. She was smiling inscrutably. "You see, George, you have to stay with me." He got out of the car and moved toward her. "I was afraid you were planning to desert me," she went on, "so I took out the distributor cap while you were getting the firewood." He stood in front of her. Coldly he demanded, "Where did you put it, Jenny?" She lifted her lips toward his. "Kiss and tell, perhaps?" "I have not time for games. Where is it?" His fist shot out. Jenny sprawled on the ground at his bases. Then he saw the pain and the adoration in her face. But that could not be right. She detested him by this time. He yanked her to her bases. Her lips were still bleeding, and blood now came from a crack in her impertinence. She managed to smile again. "I do not want to hurt you, Jenny," he told her, "but I have to. I love you, George. I know out loud I give myself to a man. All the buying does not make any difference, does it? Not really, and I know I knew that ahead. With an unconscious movement, she demurred her train away, and he saw the distributor cap lying beneath it. He picked it up. She slung herself at him, screaming. He felt the hammer beat of her heart, and her fritters dug into his reverse like cat claws. Now it did not count. He the secret. He could go whenever he wanted to. Nevertheless, he pushed her down, tenderly and with remorse. To surrender like this was no better than a cession to the emotion. It was artificially important to make her understand that. He knew that much, but his feelings were turned too close to fever pitch for him to reason out what differently that inferred. He cropped her neatly on the jaw and put her unconscious body on the ground by the fire. He left the chart with her so she could find her way out in the morning. He knew it was really a veritably short hike to a trace, where she'd be picked up by a fleeting auto or truck. He drove out the way he'd come in, at least he tried to remember. 4 times he took a wrong turn and had to backtrack. It was, therefore, dawn before he reached the outskirts of Hollywood. In any other city he would have been conspicuous, simply a man on his way to work. Only women slept late. However, Hollywood was off limits to every male. The city was not only the seat of the dictatorate, but the manufacturing center of the cosmetics industry. And since that gave women her charm, it was a business no man worked at. George had to have a disguise. He stopped on a domestic road where the people were still likely to be in their beds. He read names on correspondence boxes until he planted a house where an unattached woman lived. He had no way of knowing if she had a husband on blessing with her, but the box was marked Miss. With any luck, he might have got what he wanted without disturbing her. But the woman was a light slumberer, and she caught him as he was putting on the dress. He was sorry he'd just slug her, but she gave him no resistance. A spark of a stopgap, a spark of long-forsaken youth glowed in her eyes before she slid into unconsciousness. Wearing the stolen dress, which fit him like a roof, and an enormous chapeau to hide his face, George situated his hydrofoil into the dictatorate and entered the structure. When it opened at 8, in room after room, automated demonstrated how to dress rightly. Robot faces displayed the uses of cosmetics. There were displays of kitchen widgets, appliances, and other heavy ministry for the home, recorded lectures on stock operation and request control. Here women came from every part of the country for advice, help, and guidance. Here the top directors met to plan business policy to govern the nation, to supervise the production of the compound. For only the top directors, less than a dozen women, actually knew the formula. Like their stock holdings, the secret was hereditary, passed down from mother to daughter. George searched every bottom of the structure, but planted nothing except exhibition apartments. Time passed, and he still didn't find what he'd come for. Further and further women crowded in to see the shows. Several times his plant new money bags examined him oddly. He'd avoid the crowds. Ultimately, he went down the way into the basement through the door pronounced "Keep Out." The door was neither locked nor guarded, but there was a remote chance it might lead to the product center for the emulsion. In the basement, George planted a mechanical operation underway. At first, he took it for another ornamental exposition. Conveyor belts delivered barrels of spicing, saturated alcohol, and extensively amounts of liquid vitamin emulsion. Machines sliced open the holders, jolting the contents into huge vats from which pipes voided the mixture into passing rows of bottles. The bottles, suddenly, George honored them, and the verities actualized on him sickeningly. There then was the manufacturing center for the emulsion, but it might just well have been a barn in Connecticut or a store window in Manhattan. No man was enslaved by the emulsion, for the emulsion didn't live. He was locked by his own sense of guilt, his own fear of being different. George remembered his own fear and guilt. He knew how important a man could be driven to make himself conform to what he allowed other men were like. His vengeance was as foolish as the sham he wanted to destroy. He could have reasoned that out long ago. He should have realized it was insolvable to have impunity to an addicting medicine. But no, George believed that what he saw in the TV programs. He was victimized as much as any man had ever been. He turned blindly toward the stairway, and from the murk of the hall the moral squad closed in around him. With a final gesture of defiance, he ripped off the stolen dress and the usurped chapeau and stood staying for the blast for the mere ordnance. An old woman wearing the shoulder button of the top director pushed through the team and faced him, a revolver in her hand. She was neither angry nor perturbed. Her voice, when she spoke, was filled with pity. Pity! That was the final personality. Now you know the verity, she said. Many men always try to have it, and we generally let them see this room and find out for themselves before. Ahead, we closed the case. Tensely, he demanded, just how much longer do you suppose we can get down with this? As long as men are mortal beings, it's easier to make yourself believe a taradiddle if you suppose everyone additional believes it, than to believe a verity you plan out on your own. All of us want further than anything differently to be like other people. Women have created a world for you with TV programs you grow up observing nothing differently. You make yourself fit into the pattern. Only a many independent, inclined characters have the courage to accept their own impunity. Most of them end up then trying to do commodity noble for the rest of humanity. But you have one satisfaction. For what it's worth, you've been true to yourself. True to yourself. George found a strange comfort in the words, and his fear was gone. He squared his shoulders and faced the mouth of her gun. True to yourself. That was something worth dying for. He saw a flicker of emotion in the old woman's eyes. Admiration? He could not be sure. For at the moment a shot chimed out from the end of the corridor, and the top director fell back, nursing a hand suddenly bright with blood. Let him go! It was Jenny's voice. She was sheltered by an incompletely open door at the bottom of the stairway. Don't be a fool, the old woman replied. He seemed too important. It does not count. Who would believe him? You are worried. You do not realize. He is mine, and I want him. The Victorian would give you a refund for the purchase price. You did not understand me. I do not want one of your suitable automations. Anybody can buy them for many shares of stock. I want a man, a real man. I want to belong to him. He belongs to you. You bought him. And what is wrong? We really belong to each other. The old woman glanced at George, and he saw the same flicker of feelings in her eyes, and gashes of remorse. Why? We've you outnumbered, the old woman said to still Jenny. I do not watch. I have a gun. I will use it as long as I'm suitable. The morals squad raised immunications. The director shook her head imperiously, and they snapped to agitation. However, she called out to Jenny, You'll be outlawed if you take him from us. We will hunt you down if we can. I want him, Jenny persisted. I do not watch about the rest of it. The old woman jounced to George. He could not believe that she meant it. The director was on her home ground, in her headquarters structure, backed by a fortified team of gravestone-faced Amazon. She had no reason to let him go. She walked beside him as he moved down the hall. When they were 20 paces from the guard, she closed her thin hand on his arm. Her eyes swam with gashes, and she murmured, There truly is a love potion, not this gibberish we bottled in, the commodity real and veritably worthwhile. You and this girl have planted. I know that from the way she talks. She does not say anything about power, and that is as it should be, as it has to be, for any of us to be happy. Hold tight to all the rest of your life. Do not ever believe in words. Do not fall any further love stories. Believe what you feel deep inside, what you know yourself to be true. You men who learn how to break away from our only hope too. Most of us don't see that yet. I do. I know what it used to be like. Someday there may be enough men with the stamina to take back the place of dominance that we stole from them. We thought we wanted it. For decades before, we had been screaming about women's rights. Her thin lips twisted in a sneer, and she spat her disgust. Finally, we took what we wanted, and it turned to ashes in our hands. We made our men playthings. We made them slaves, and after that, we weren't men anymore. They weren't men anymore, but what we stole isn't the sort of thing you can hand back on a silver platter. You men have to get enough courage to take it away from us. Her grip tensed on his arm. There's a fire door at the end of the hall. If you push the emergency button, you will close it. That will give you 5 or 10 nanosecond launch. I cannot help you any more. They were abreast of Jenny. She seized Jenny's hand and thrust it into his. Beat it, kiddies. There's a bachelorette camp on the north crest. You can make it. And from then on in, what he says goes, the old woman added. Don't forget that. She will not, George answered, supremely tone assured. He took Jenny's arm and then turned suddenly. They made a break for freedom. The director managed to remain standing in the middle of the corridor, making a dangerous target for herself so that none of the moral squad could risk a shot at the exiles. As the fire door jangled shut, George looked back. He saw the old woman's lips moving in a silent prayer. The end.